A simple brew spilled everything, except the murderer's name. Welcome to Marple Mysteries. I am your host, Harrington. Join the conversation. Drop your location in the comments. You all make this journey unforgettable. Let's begin. It was a Tuesday, which meant Fritz was fussing with veal and my morning plans were being kicked around like a can in an alley. I had just returned from picking up Wolfe's special order oolong from Woo's Imports when the doorbell rang. That's the chime of doom at our house, at least for me. For Wolfe, it just means another pebble in the shoe of his daily routine, and maybe, if it's interesting enough, a new excuse to lecture humanity. I swung the front door open and was greeted by a woman in a coat that cost more than the Plymouth I was parked in last week. She had cheekbones sharp enough to slice a tomato, and eyes that suggested she either sold art or weapons, possibly both. "I'm looking for Mr. Nero Wolfe," she said, crisp and unsentimental. "That makes two of us," I said. "He's in the plant, rooms with his orchids, but if you're a client, you'll have to wait until he's extracted himself from his chlorophyll cocoon." She didn't smile. She also didn't move. So I stood aside. "Come in," I added. "Wouldn't want to deprive the carpets of high fashion." She stepped inside like she was casing the joint for a tasteful burglary. I took her coat, noting that it smelled faintly of rosemary and smoke, like someone who cooked but didn't. "Eat." I asked her name. Lena Delamere. It clicked, or at least it clinked. Lena Delamere was a name I'd seen on one of those society pages that gets folded over in the Times. Art curator, gallery darling, hostess of the infamous tea salon on East 82nd. The type who dealt in priceless conversation and price-tagged pottery. "What brings you here, Miss Delamere? Lose a money?" "No," she said, seating herself without invitation. Rare, bold. "I've lost a friend, or rather, she lost something. And now she's missing." I gave her the long, neutral stare I keep for people who talk like riddles, but dress like statements you might want to back up, I said. "People don't vanish over misplaced coasters." "She didn't vanish. She's hiding. Or she's scared. Maybe both." Her voice shifted a gear. "Her name is Sophie Carston. She worked for me. Assistant curator. Reliable. Precise. Never late. 3 days ago, she left a note on my desk after hours. Just 4 words. He saw the bag. Then she disappeared." Bag. Tea. Bag. That earned a raised eyebrow from me. "That a code for something kinky or something criminal?" She looked dead at me. "I don't know. But Sophie was drinking jasmine tea in the break room Friday. She left early. Monday she's gone, and she doesn't leave cryptic notes unless she's scared. Or worse." I sat back. "You're not here because of your friend. You're here because of that tea bag." A beat. "Yes, because whatever was in that bag scared her into running." I studied her. "Let me guess. You want Wolfe to sniff this out?" "I want Wolfe to tell me who's lying." I glanced toward the elevator. That led to Wolfe's private rooftop paradise of orchids and humidity. Disturbing him before noon is usually a crime punishable by death, or worse, a lecture on senseless intrusion. But something about Lena Delamere said this was going to matter. Not to the world, but to Wolfe. He liked truth the way some men liked. Brandy, dark, complex, and worth the wait. "Wait here," I told her. "I'll go see if the mountain will come to Muhammad." I headed up to the plant rooms, where Wolfe was interrogating a new hybrid with the same tone he reserved for senators and swindlers. I gave him the lowdown: Lena, Sophie, the cryptic note, and the tea bag that apparently witnessed a felony. He didn't move. He didn't blink. He just muttered, "Pfui," then turned another pot a precise 30 degrees. But I saw it, the slight narrowing of the eyes, the kind of reaction he saves for puzzles, provocations, and violations of routine. When he finally spoke, it was with his usual glacial certainty. "Bring her up. I dislike tea, but I detest lies." And that's how it began. with a bag of dried leaves and a vanished assistant. And me, as always, in the middle of a case where the truth was steeping somewhere dark. By the time I got back downstairs, Lena Delamere was browsing our bookshelf like she was at an estate sale. I cleared my throat, not gently. "He'll see." "You?" I said, which doesn't mean he likes the idea. She followed me up to the office, where the air is thick with leather, patience, and judgment. Wolfe was in his oversized throne, the picture of immobility surrounded by books, ledgers, and silence. The only movement in the room was his pinky, stirring his glass of beer like it owed him something. "Miss Delamere," I said, "this is Nero Wolfe. He's bigger than he looks in your imagination." She crossed the room like a woman who'd never been told no, extended a gloved hand, which Wolfe ignored, and sat without waiting. That gave me a solid 3 signs she didn't know the rules and one that she didn't care. "I've explained the broad strokes," I said, "but maybe she can sharpen the edges." Wolfe didn't look at her. He looked at the orchid on the table beside him, as if it might speak first. Finally, he addressed the room. "You have my attention, Miss Delamere. A rare commodity. Spend. It wisely." She leaned forward. "As I told Mr. Goodwin, my assistant Sophie Carston vanished after leaving a note on my desk. 4 words. He saw the bag. I didn't understand it. Still don't. But I know Sophie. She wouldn't write a cryptic note unless something frightened her. Something involving someone she couldn't name." "You said she vanished," Wolfe said. "Be specific." "She didn't come in Monday or Tuesday. She hasn't answered calls. No one's seen her. I went to her apartment last night. Her landlord let me in. The place was untouched, her coat, wallet, keys, all there. But she's not. And the police? I haven't called them." Wolfe closed his eyes briefly. "Why not?" "Because if Sophie's in hiding, there's a reason she doesn't want to be found by just anyone. And if she's in danger, I need someone who won't knock on every door like a drum major. I need precision." Wolfe's eyes opened. "Flattery wastes. My time continue." She took a breath. "The tea bag, I believe it matters. Friday evening I saw Sophie in the break room. She had made a cup of tea, Jasmine, I think. We'd just wrapped a gallery board meeting. Very contentious. 3 of the board members were still in the building. Sophie had access to confidential meeting notes. She'd been cataloguing archival pieces, including a Ming Dynasty scroll that had questions around provenance. That's when I found the note." "You think she saw something? Or heard something?" I said. "I think someone saw her seeing something." Wolfe steepled his fingers. "Who are these board members?" "Zane Merrick, our gallery's financial director. Agnes Trent, co-founder. And a woman named Ivy Quillen, an appraiser who's been circling the gallery with suspicious intensity. All 3 were in the building Friday evening. All had access. And motives. Motives for what? I asked. She paused. We've had quiet concerns about forgery, a potential plant among the acquisitions. That raised Wolfe's eyebrows, which is like watching a mountain twitch. He gestured toward his notebook, and I took the hint, grabbing it off his desk and opening to a clean page. Names, he said. Spellings, she gave them. I wrote. Then she added, and there's one more name. Calder Ames, Sophie's ex, a fellow curator. They parted badly 6 months ago. He still drops by. He'd know where she'd run or why. Wolfe sighed through his nose. Miss Delamere, you suspect 4 people, including a former paramour, of instigating a disappearance involving a tea bag, a cryptic note, and an undocumented forgery. And you wish me to disentangle this in silence from this chair? She nodded once. Yes, that's exactly what I want. He considered her. Then, with deliberate grace, rang the desk bell once. Fritz appeared like a summoned spirit. Bring tea, Wolfe said. Jasmine. Fritz hesitated. Wolfe nodded. Fritz vanished. Then Wolfe turned to me. Archie. Assemble dossiers on these individuals. Find Sophie Carston's current whereabouts and locate the bag. I want the bag. The tea bag? Yes, the tea bag. If it exists, it is the only object in this narrative not corrupted by motive. That makes it invaluable. I stood. So we're taking the case? No, Wolfe said. I am tolerating its existence. Miss Delamere stood too, brushing a speck of imagined dust from her sleeve. I'll expect updates. You may expect nothing, Wolfe replied. You may hope. She left the room like smoke leaving a room, swift, scented, and slightly charged. I turned to Wolfe. You believe her? I believe she is afraid of what this might reveal, which makes her useful, not honest. He looked at the door. The brownstone is now contaminated. We must proceed. By Wednesday morning, the case had taken up residence in the brownstone, like an unwelcome guest with too much luggage. Wolfe, of course, hadn't left his chair and had no intention of doing so, but he had a list of names, which meant I had a list of errands. First on my itinerary was Zane Merrick, the gallery's financial director. According to Lena's notes and the background check I had Saul run overnight, Zane was clean on paper and slick in person. He managed the gallery's budget, like a magician manages a deck of cards, too fast for anyone to really follow. His office was in a sleek building on Fifth Avenue, all glass walls and silence. I introduced myself as a private consultant, handling a matter related to the Carston disappearance, which is a fancy way of saying I was sniffing around and hoped he'd bark. Zane Merrick looked like the kind of guy who bought expensive watches and then made sure you knew it. Early 40s, polished hair, not a wrinkle on his tailored navy suit. Sophie Carston, he said, after I dropped her name and watched his pupils twitch. She's not missing, she's just freelancing on her own time. Interesting, I said. Did she freelance right after leaving you a cryptic note about someone seeing a tea bag? He blinked, too slow. I don't know anything about that. Then you wouldn't mind telling me where you were Friday evening. He leaned back in his ergonomic throne and smiled like he'd practiced it. In the gallery's accounting room, alone, working on Q2 audits. I left around 10. Sophie was still here when I went. That was something. Lena had said Sophie left. Early. You see anyone else? Agnes came through briefly. Ivy was in the East Wing cataloguing some inventory. But no, not really. I thanked him and left, filing Zane under professionally slick, personally shifty. He hadn't asked who hired me. That either meant he knew or didn't want to. Next up, Agnes Trent, co-founder of the gallery, 80 years old, hard of hearing, and reputedly sharper than a gallery nail. Her Upper West Side apartment had the feel of a retired jungle, velvet, couches hanging ferns, African masks, and a grandfather clock that ticked like it meant business. She served me coffee from a silver set and looked at me with the cool confidence of someone who'd already survived her obituary being printed by mistake. Sophie's a lovely girl, she said. Too good for this business, really. Always. Knew where things belonged, even if others didn't. You think someone moved something they shouldn't have, I asked. She stirred her coffee. Oh, I know it. Zane's been playing fast and loose with acquisitions. Ivy appraises whatever he hands her. Calder Ames has been sniffing around again. Bad sign. I raised an eyebrow. You think Sophie got in the middle of something? Agnes took a slow sip. She's the kind of girl who would confront someone quietly, write a note and vanish when it all went sideways. Probably thought she was being noble. That's always the dangerous kind. Were you there Friday evening? She nodded. I stayed late. I had an argument with Zane. I left around 7. Sophie was still there. So now 2 suspects had both placed Sophie at the gallery after she supposedly left early. Either Lena's memory was slipping or someone was fogging the timeline. From Agnes's, I walked 15 blocks and 1 lifetime to Ivy Quillen's loft in Soho. Ivy answered the door in yoga pants and a black tunic, looking like someone who curated both art and her own Instagram. Her loft was sterile in that gallery way. White walls, metal furniture, no soul. I introduced myself and mentioned Sophie. She didn't flinch, but her voice got flatter than a cold pancake. "Sophie's missing. Since when?" "Monday. Left a note Friday night. 4 words. He saw the bag." She gave a polite smile with no teeth. "Sounds like a fortune cookie." I watched her eyes. "You were at the gallery Friday night?" "Yes, I was reviewing the Ming scrolls. Lena asked me to check the inventory chain again. Standard procedure." "You see Sophie?" "A glimpse around 6. She was upset, rattled, didn't say why. That made 3 versions of her emotional state: calm, noble, and upset." I asked, "What do you know about Calder Ames?" "More than I want to," she said. "He's charming until he's cornered. Then he's venom in a suit." "Interesting." I let that hang, then tossed one more into the fire. "Any idea what she meant by the bag?" "No." But this time her mouth said no while her fingers clenched the mug just a hair tighter. I added Ivy to the list of people who had too many answers that didn't answer anything. That left Calder Ames, the ex-boyfriend, with romantic indigestion. He lived in a sublet downtown, in a pre-war walk-up that smelled like garlic and lost ambition. Calder opened the door shirtless and suspicious, like someone who hadn't been asleep, but still didn't like being interrupted. "Sophie's gone?" he said after I explained. "Gone how?" "Gone as in left no trace." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I haven't seen her in weeks. She stopped answering my messages. I figured she moved on." "You were close once." "We were, I blew it. But she didn't just disappear, not like that." I asked him about Friday. He was home, alone, painting. Not a great alibi, unless the canvas could testify. When I brought up the tea bag, he blinked. "What?" "Sophie left a note. Said someone saw a bag." "Any idea?" He didn't answer right away. Then, slowly, "She'd been talking about something off with a shipment. Something from the Ming collection. She said she thought someone was inserting pieces that weren't real." "Forged?" He nodded. "Sophie wasn't paranoid, but she was careful. She told me once, 'Art doesn't lie.' But people lie about art all the time." I liked that, so would Wolfe. Back at the brownstone by 6, I reported in. Wolfe was chewing on a slab of roast duck from Fritz's kitchen and listening like a cat listens to rain, tolerantly, but with intent. I ran through the lineup. Zane, the charming numbers man with vague answers. Agnes, the aged hawk with a memory like a guillotine. Ivy, poised and artificial. And Calder, the brooding ex who knew just enough to worry me. Wolfe tapped his finger once, then said, "And the tea bag?" "No one knows what it means. Or pretends they don't," he grunted. "Find the bag." "Still with that?" "Yes," he said, "because it is the one fixed point in a storm of ambiguity. The bag existed. She wrote about it. It was seen, which means it is not conjecture. Find the bag, Archie, then we find her." He reached for his beer. "And if you must bring Saul in, this matter now festers," which meant things were finally getting interesting. Thursday morning started with 2 things. Wolfe refusing a call from Lena Delamere and me getting a list of marching orders before I'd even finished my eggs. The top item, still stubbornly, bizarrely, was find the tea bag. "I am not searching city garbage for botanical evidence," I told him. "No," Wolfe said, "you are searching minds, and perhaps cupboards." That was his way of saying, "Go snoop, Goodwin." And he said it with the kind of casual command that suggested he'd never lifted a finger, unless it involved butter or a book. I dressed, grabbed my notebook, and headed out with a name circled twice in red pencil, Ivy Quillen. There'd been something about Ivy's stillness during our last conversation, not guilt. She struck me as too cold to blush, but calculation. If anyone knew what Sophie saw in that tea bag, it'd be Ivy. So I decided to start where all subtle investigations begin, with blatant trespassing. I swung by the gallery, this time posing as a courier dropping off restoration paperwork. The receptionist, an ambitious young man in rectangular glasses and perpetual fear, buzzed me through when I told him I had business for Ms. Quillen's private review. Ivy wasn't in, but her office door was cracked and I had a window. Inside, the room was all hard angles and grayscale, metal shelves, glass-topped desk, and file boxes labeled with painter names and accession codes. On her desk sat a ceramic cup, still faintly stained inside, and next to it in a glass dish was a used jasmine tea bag, dried out, intact. I did what any self-respecting detective would do. I bagged it with a tissue and dropped it in a small sample pouch I carry for situations that call for evidence collection or illicit lunch storage. Then I slipped out, nodded at the receptionist, and exited before anyone noticed Ivy's brew had walked off. I phoned Wolfe from the street. "You have it?" he asked. "Yes. Dried, used, and unglamorous." "Bring it. And don't touch it again." Which meant it was going under his microscope. Not metaphorically. Literally. Back at the brownstone, I handed it off. He barely looked up. "It may contain oils," he murmured, placing it on a petri dish like it was a Fabergé egg. "Residue, perhaps more." "What exactly do you think it tells us?" "That it existed," Wolfe said, "and that it was left behind intentionally. A message unwrapped." "Now, back to Sophie. Where is she?" "That's when I called Saul Panzer. If you don't know Saul, you've never needed someone who can shadow a man through Penn Station during rush hour and still tell you what brand of cigarettes he smokes. He's the best in the business, and even Wolfe defers to him on the rare occasions he admits needing a second mind. I gave Saul everything we had, Sophie's last known address, her haunts, and the possible names she might reach out to. He said he'd start digging quietly. By nightfall, I had one more name to visit on my own. Sophie's downstairs neighbor, a grad student named Lila who owed me a favor after I'd once helped her recover a missing cat and a missing boyfriend, both of whom were found behind on rent. Lila met me in the hallway of Sophie's building, twisting her hands in a pretend-I'm-not-nervous gesture. She was tense, Lila said. "The last time I saw her. She came home Friday night late, stayed in all weekend. I heard her pacing." "Did she say anything?" "She told me not to open the door if someone named Zane came around. That was something." "Did he?" "No. But someone else did. A woman Monday morning, banged hard, sounded angry." "You see her?" "No, just heels, sharp ones, fast walk. I think she took something from under Sophie's door after." "What kind of something?" Lila paused. "A small envelope. She left with it. I filed that under suspicious behavior number 27. I thanked her and dropped Wolfe a line with the update. His reply, "Return. I have examined the bag." Back at the brownstone, he was seated as always, but with a curious glow in his eyes. Not joy, heaven forbid, but interest. "Archie," he said, "this tea bag is not just jasmine." He held up a slide under the light. "It contains trace elements of saffron, expensive, rarely used in prepackaged teas. Fritz confirmed it's culinary grade, not infusional. This was doctored. You're saying someone tampered with her tea? I'm saying someone inserted a message into it. Saffron is invisible in that amount, but carries scent. Sophie would have noticed. It was a signal. Someone left that for her. Or she left it for someone else. That changed the stakes. The tea bag wasn't just a metaphor. It was a literal message, the way spies used to pass notes in books or write. On shirt cuffs, Wolfe stood, or rather shifted, and summoned me to the globe where he kept his rare teas. Only one other person would know to use saffron as a marker. Lena Delamere. "You think Lena left the bag?" "No. I think Lena found it, knew what it meant, and lied. She said Sophie drank tea Friday night, but if this was left behind in Ivy's office, Sophie never drank it, she planted it. For Lena? No. For whoever came next. Ivy, Zane, someone. And now she's missing. He nodded. Someone discovered the message. Intercepted. Which means Sophie either ran humming or was made to disappear. He nodded, then said the words I had hoped to avoid for one more day. Call Inspector Kramer. I made the call. Kramer, to his credit, didn't yell. Much. You're telling me you've been sitting on a disappearance and what, smuggling tea bags around like contraband? She left a note, Kramer. Said someone saw the bag. Wolfe thinks it was a signal. And that someone found it first. You have proof? We have saffron. Phooey. That's Wolfe's line. He hung up. That's how you know Kramer's interested. He doesn't bother insulting you first. That evening Saul called. She's alive, he said. Sophie, I found her. Where? East Orange. Friend's place. She's scared, but she'll talk. I called Wolfe. She's been found, I said. Should I bring her in? No, speak to her. Alone? Ask only what matters. We don't spook the deer. So I drove out to East Orange and found Sophie in a dim apartment with floral wallpaper and tension in the air thick enough to trip on. She looked pale but lucid. She opened the door and looked at me like she'd been expecting someone else. You're not him, she said. No, I'm the one who gets to ask the questions. And that's how I got the first truth in days. Sophie Karsten looked like someone who had been told the end of the story and didn't like how it turned out. She sat stiffly on the edge of a love seat with worn floral cushions, clutching a mug of cold chamomile and glancing toward the window every time a car passed by. The apartment wasn't hers. It belonged to the friend in the kitchen who kept pretending not to eavesdrop, and her body language said this was temporary, both as a location and a state of mind. I took the chair across from her and made it clear. We had all the time in the world. She gave me the kind of look you give someone about to lie but deciding not to bother. You're not a cop, she said. That's good. No badge, no gun, no warrant, I replied. Just a license and an eccentric genius back in a chair who wants to know why you vanished over a tea bag. Her eyes snapped to mine at that. I didn't vanish, she said. I got out before someone made me disappear. Well, that's a technical difference. You left a note, a strange one. I know it wasn't for Lena, it was for Ivy. That got my attention. You wrote the note for Ivy? Sophie nodded slowly. She was supposed to find it. It was misdirection. Explain. She took a deep breath. I knew someone had tampered with one of the Ming scrolls. The ink, something was off. Ivy said it had been authenticated already, but I checked the restoration files. There was a gap, a few hours of undocumented handling. It happens sometimes, but it shouldn't, so I mentioned it to Lena. She denied it. She asked me to drop it. Not directly, but she said some pieces have narratives that don't always line up perfectly, and that provenance is fluid in the art world, which is a polite way of saying a mind your own. Exactly, so I started documenting things. Notes, images, timestamps. I kept a file. I was planning to show it to Agnes. She may be old, but she's honest. What happened instead? I saw Zane Friday evening. He was in Ivy's office looking through her notes. When he left, he dropped something, an envelope. I picked it up. Inside was a tea bag, but it wasn't just tea. It smelled like saffron, which isn't standard in break room blends. No, she said, and I recognized the scent because Lena uses it in one of her custom blends at her salon events. It's her signature. So you thought Lena had left it as a sign? I thought she'd sent it as a warning or a code. She and I talked once about ways people used to pass notes in tea back in old political salons in London. Hidden messages, scents, things like that. I figured she was telling me someone was onto me. But now you think Zane left it. I don't know anymore. Maybe Lena planted it. Maybe Zane stole it from her. Maybe Ivy was the target. All I know is someone saw that I had it, Who? She hesitated. I think Calder. Your ex? She nodded. He came by that night. Uninvited, said he was worried, but he saw the bag. I hadn't hidden it well. I think he realized what it meant, or thought he did. That's why I left the note. He saw the bag and got out of there. And then I took my file, locked it in an envelope, and stashed it in my locker at the gallery. I figured if someone was hunting for me, they'd look everywhere but the most obvious place. Did you tell anyone else? No, and that was the mistake. I didn't say it, but she was probably right. I left with a promise not to disclose her location, yet, and drove straight back to the brownstone. Wolfe was in a foul mood, which meant I got a cold look and a warm command to sit and explain. I gave him the rundown. Sophie, the planted note, the suspicion around the saffron, and the file locked in the gallery. When I finished, he was silent long enough for me to check if he was breathing. She left it in her locker, he finally said. That's what she said. She's a fool. Agreed. He rang for Fritz and asked for tea, then sent me back out into the world with a simple command. Retrieve the envelope. It was after hours at the gallery, but I still had the courier badge from yesterday and a mild talent for lock-picking courtesy of a misspent youth and a decent mentor. Sophie's locker was in the staff room on the lower level, tucked behind an ugly divider and a vending machine that only sold ginger ale and regret. It wasn't locked. That was the first problem. The second was what wasn't there. The envelope was gone. I checked twice, thrice. I even went through the adjacent lockers in case she'd fudged the location. Nothing. No file, no envelope. No tea leaves. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe took the news with the composure of a man hearing someone mispronounce Latin. Someone found it, he said, and didn't want us to know what it contained, which suggests it had teeth. He nodded once. And eyes. The next morning I received a package addressed to Wolfe. No return address. Postmarked Midtown. Inside was a single sheet of paper. A scanned image, grainy low-res of a restoration chart. One of the Ming scrolls annotated in red, but only one note was legible, a single word, circled, substituted. Wolfe didn't blink. This is a warning. From Sophie. No. From the person who took the file, telling us to stop, that we know enough. I looked at the envelope again. There were 2 creases on the flap, horizontal bends, like it had been opened and closed by someone in a hurry. Then something caught my eye. A faint smudge near the seal. I held it to the light. Not ink, lipstick. A sharp burgundy, half faded, like someone had licked the edge before sealing it. I turned to Wolfe. Guess who wears lipstick like this? He didn't answer. He didn't have to. Ivy Quillen. By Friday morning, the case was starting to wear grooves into the brownstone's usual calm. Wolfe had refused all visitors and all breakfast conversation, and Fritz was tiptoeing around the kitchen like we were in mourning. I'd laid the scanned document out for him again. Substituted, in red, the lipstick trace on the envelope. The missing file. He stared at it like it had personally insulted his orchids. This confirms what Sophie suspected, Wolfe said finally. A substitution was made. Someone replaced a genuine scroll with a forgery, and then someone else tried to bury the evidence. More than one someone, I said. Ivy took the envelope. Zane probably left the tea bag. Calder might have spotted the whole thing. Lena's lying about something. Agnes? Well, she's probably knitting an alibi as we speak. Phoy, Wolfe muttered, which meant he agreed. That's when the doorbell rang. I answered it, half expecting Inspector Kramer and his cigar to barge in like an underpaid bulldozer. Instead, I found Saul Panzer. He stepped inside, shook off the cold, and handed me a small manila envelope. No return address, he said. It was taped to my car window this morning. Thought you'd want it intact. I brought it in to Wolfe, who opened it delicately. Inside was a photo, an 8x10, glossy, professionally printed. It showed a woman standing in front of a storage unit. She was mid-sentence, mouth open, eyes sharp. Her hand held a clipboard, and next to her, partially visible, was the Ming scroll, the genuine one. Wolfe studied it for a long moment. "That's Ivy," I said. "Indeed. And this image was never meant to exist. Then who took it?" "That," Wolfe said, "is the only useful question. Find the photographer." It was Saul who made the connection. He remembered the angle from a job 6 months back, when he'd followed a gallery assistant to the same location. A private art storage facility in Midtown, secure, camera-free, and mostly cash-based. The kind of place people used when they didn't want provenance, just possession. So I paid it a visit. Under the guise of collecting a restored installation frame, courtesy of a fake invoice I whipped up with Saul's help, I got a peek at their registry. Ivy had been in and out several times in the last 2 months. One entry stood out, the Friday before Sophie vanished, but more interesting was who had signed her in, not Ivy herself, Zane Merrick. I called Wolfe from the corner of 45th and Lex. "Zane signed her in," I told him. "Ivy, Friday night." "Then he knows." "Possibly. Helped. Or he's being blackmailed." "Same result," Wolfe said. "Return, we must position the pieces. This is nearly ripened." When I got back, Wolfe was setting the board, metaphorically and otherwise. He had laid out dossiers, my notes, the photo, the scanned scroll chart, and dictated a summons list to me as if he were inviting them to tea instead of suspicion. Ivy Quillen, Zane Merrick, Lena Delamere, Agnes Trent, Calder Ames. "You're calling a gathering?" "Indeed," Wolfe said, "but not yet. One more thread." That's when the trespass happened. I had stepped into the kitchen to pour Fritz and myself a celebratory glass of root beer. We don't drink on the job, but bubbles help the thinking. And when I came back, Wolfe was staring at the globe on the desk. It was open. He hadn't opened it. The saffron jar was missing. It hit like a cold slap. Wolfe's teas are sacred. No one touches that globe but him, Fritz, and me. And I hadn't. Which meant someone had been inside the brownstone. Recently, quietly, and they had taken exactly one thing, a jar of saffron. The envelope was lipstick, I said. "And now the saffron's gone. She's tying off the loose ends." Wolfe didn't answer. He stood slowly. For him, that's a 4-alarm fire. He walked to the globe and looked inside, as if he expected to find the culprit crouched under the chamomile. Then he turned to me. "She was here," he said. "Ivy sometime in the last hour. The jar was present before Fritz served lunch." "I called Saul," he answered on the second ring. "Already on it." I didn't ask how he knew. That's Saul. Instead, I checked the front door locks. They were intact, no scratches, which meant Ivy, or someone, had a key. A copy. I returned. To Wolfe, "She has access." "She has fear," he corrected. "She is attempting to erase the trail." He paused, then said something I'd only heard once before. "Call the police." That meant one thing. The game was ending, but the final card hadn't been played yet. That night, as Wolfe chewed through a pork loin and I scribbled timelines on a yellow legal pad, Saul called again. "I saw her," he said. "Outside the gallery. She was burning something in a trash bin, small papers, and what looked like a tea wrapper. Could you recover anything?" "No." She flooded it. Wolfe heard this and scowled. "We will make her regret that. We had what we needed. A lie about the bag, a stolen file, a forged scroll, and a jar of saffron gone missing from a brownstone where no one's supposed to enter. It wasn't about the art anymore. It was about control. And Wolfe doesn't like being moved on his own board. The invitations went out that night. Tomorrow, Wolfe said, we gather the suspects, and the bag will speak. I just hoped the truth was still listening. It takes A particular kind of arrogance to summon 5 suspects to a brownstone in Manhattan and assume they'll all show up without a subpoena or a gun in sight. But Wolfe had that arrogance, polished and lacquered with years of success. He called it confidence, and for him, it always paid off. By 2 p.m. Saturday they had arrived, not together, God forbid, but within 15 minutes of one another. I greeted them each at the door and made a game of watching how they reacted when they realized who else was there. Zane Merrick looked polished but jumpy, like a man wearing a suit 1 size too small. Ivy Quillen wore black again, this time with a lipstick 1 shade lighter than the smear on the envelope. Lena Delamere came armed with her usual perfume and passive disdain. Agnes Trent was in a purple shawl and had brought her knitting, and aggressive act of composure. Calder Ames looked like he hadn't slept, which meant he'd either found his conscience or misplaced something worse. I led them, one by one, into the office. Wolfe didn't rise when they entered. He never does. He sat behind his desk, mountainous and unreadable, hands folded on a blotter like a judge with no gavel, just judgment. I took my usual seat to his right, notebook ready, fountain pen loaded, eyes sharp. Once they were all seated, Wolfe spoke without preamble. "I do not enjoy intrusion," he said. "Not in my home, not in logic. Yet this case has brought both. Miss Carson's disappearance was not criminal in the legal sense. It was reactive, born of fear, a justified instinct. The cause of that fear, however, is criminal. Someone among you engineered deceit. Someone knew that a valuable piece of art had been replaced, and someone took steps to silence the person who knew it." A shiver of silence passed through the room. Wolfe gestured toward the small tea globe on the side table. Inside, the saffron jar was back in place, courtesy of Saul Panzer, who had recovered it in a paper bag discarded 2 blocks from the gallery. Ivy had tried to dispose of it like a cigarette butt. Saul had retrieved it like a diamond. "This jar," Wolfe continued, "contains culinary saffron. It is not used in teas. It was used once, in a tea bag, as a scent-based code between 2 people. Miss Carson found the bag. She left a note. He saw the bag. You all know this, but you do not yet know what she meant." Wolfe turned to Ivy. "Miss Quillen, you claimed you didn't know what the note referred to. That is false. You took the envelope Miss Carson left in her locker. You opened it, you resealed it, you mailed us a piece of it in warning. And you entered this house without invitation." Ivy's jaw set. Please." Wolfe held up a hand. "There is no dignity in denial now. Your fingerprint is on the inside of the saffron jar, which you attempted to dispose of in public waste. Mr. Panzer recovered it. Your lipstick was on the envelope flap. It was a rushed seal, a mistake." Zane shifted in his chair, then looked at her, visibly rattled. "You broke in." "I retrieved what she should never have had," Ivy said, a low, hard whisper. "You know why?" Wolfe gave a faint smile. "Yes, because you were both part of it. The forgery." He turned to Zane. "Mr. Merrick, you signed Miss Quillen into the storage facility where the original scroll was kept. You replaced it with a forgery. She appraised the fake and certified it." "That's not true." "Don't lie," Agnes Trent said suddenly. Everyone turned. Wolfe inclined his head. "You knew?" Agnes nodded, her voice firm. "I suspected. Ivy's appraisal came too quickly. Zane's records had a discrepancy. Just a few hours. But I know his style. Sophie came to me with questions. She had proof. I told her to hold off confronting anyone until we had everything in writing, but she acted too fast." "She trusted Lena," Wolfe said. Lena, who had said nothing yet, crossed her legs and looked straight at Wolfe. "She trusted me, yes," she said, "but I didn't leave that tea bag. Someone else did. Ivy, I imagine. Hoping Sophie would think it was from me. Coded. A warning." But it backfired. Sophie thought it meant danger. She bolted. She was right to run, Wolfe said. Miss Carston feared she'd be silenced, so she disappeared, leaving a breadcrumb, hoping the person who found it would understand. She underestimated how many eyes were already watching. He looked at Calder Ames. You were the only one who saw her with the bag. You may not have known what it was, but you knew it mattered. Calder shook his head slowly. I thought it was another of Lena's little tea experiments. I didn't realize what it meant until later. Then she was gone. And you didn't tell anyone? He looked down. I didn't want to make it worse. Your cowardice helped. Conceal a crime, Wolfe said, but not enough. He leaned back. The forgery is the root, but the concealment, the theft of evidence, the intimidation, that is where the rot spread. No one spoke. Then Wolfe said, Miss Quillen, you forged the appraisal and tried to destroy the evidence. Mr. Merrick, you arranged the swap. Miss Delamere, you lied to protect the reputation of your gallery. Mr. Ames, you withheld knowledge out of misplaced guilt. Only Miss Trent acted with any measure of integrity, however limited by patience. He gestured to me. Archie will turn over the evidence to Inspector Kramer. I expect you'll all be hearing from the district attorney. Mr. Merrick, your financial. Logs are already compromised. Miss Quillen, the false appraisal alone constitutes fraud. Your fate, as it were, is sealed. I looked across the room. Ivy was stiff as stone. Zane was crumbling like a week-old croissant. Lena showed no reaction, which meant her mind was already doing PR math. Agnes was knitting again. Calder looked like he wanted to disappear or confess or sleep, maybe all three. Wolfe reached for his beer and said, You may go. One by one they filed out. No one spoke, no one protested. They just left, quietly, like shadows at sunrise. When the door closed behind the last of them, Wolfe exhaled slowly and said, The trouble with art is that it imitates more than life. It imitates ambition. Fritz appeared as if summoned by moral closure and announced that dinner would be served. Wolfe nodded. I turned to him. You know, for a man who hates tea, you just solved a case with one. He lifted his glass. Even leaves can speak, Archie. One must only listen properly. If you'd ever wanted to see 5 people try not to blink under the weight of their own secrets, Saturday afternoon in Nero Wolfe's office would have been the place to do it. But Section 7 was just the preview, the warm-up before the real game started. Wolfe had delivered his preliminary deductions, and now it was time for the slow surgical unpeeling. When Wolfe calls a second gathering, it's not for repetition, it's for pressure. And pressure in Wolfe's hands is an art form. The invitation this time was less polite. I called them, individually, in tones that told them they could decline if they liked, but the NYPD wouldn't be as forgiving. And they came, again. Same room, same chairs, different atmosphere. The first time they'd tried to posture. This time they were calculating exit strategies. You could smell the tension like Fritz's consomme, fragrant, refined, and about to boil. Wolfe didn't speak right away. He sat motionless, his fingers interlaced, gaze resting on a small ceramic dish placed deliberately in front of him. The tea bag, the same one Sophie hadn't steeped, the one Ivy had intercepted, the one that had been infused with saffron and soaked in layered implications. Ladies and gentlemen, Wolfe began, I find myself repeating a necessary truth. Words, like objects, are not innocent. They carry intent and they expose it, particularly when left behind. He nodded toward the dish. This was not an accident. It was a message, a silent statement. And now we are going to listen to it. No one spoke. Mr. Merrick, Wolfe said, locking eyes with Zane, you are a man accustomed to controlling outcomes, financial outcomes, institutional narratives. You used Ivy Quillen's professional credibility to launder a forgery into a legitimate archive. She, in turn, relied on the obscurity of your accounting. Zane adjusted his cufflinks. I've said I won't confirm anything without counsel. Indeed, Wolfe said. And yet you came. That suggests you're not merely defensive, you're exposed. Zane flinched, but stayed silent. Wolfe turned his head, slowly. Miss Quillen, you attempted to destroy the tea bag. You entered this house without invitation, an act not only criminal but offensive. You used a gallery key, one you had copied. Ivy, poised as ever, offered a small shrug. I returned what didn't belong to me. That's an interesting phrase, Wolfe said. It echoes the central offense. The genuine scroll did not belong to the person who removed it, and the appraisal certifying its replacement was forged, not the document but the truth beneath it. He leaned slightly forward. You intercepted Miss Carston's note. You assumed it implicated you, and you were correct. Ivy folded her hands in her lap. She could have gone to the police. She came to you, Wolfe said, with evidence, and she believed erroneously that you might protect it. Instead, you concealed it. She was scared, because she saw clearly, unlike you. That one landed. Ivy's eyes narrowed, but she didn't speak. Wolfe turned next to Lena. Miss Delamere, he said, your crime is not of origin, but of omission. You suspected what Zane and Ivy had done. You suspected it because you've seen it before, because you've allowed it before. You prize your gallery's reputation, and you were willing to compromise morality to preserve perception. Lena smiled, faint and deliberate. No one benefits from scandal, especially when there's ambiguity. Scandal, Wolfe said, is not the disease. It is the symptom. The disease is collusion. Ivy and Zane executed the crime. You, Miss Delamere, provided the silence. Lena didn't deny it. She leaned back, content to let implication do its work. Then Wolfe addressed Agnes. Miss Trent, he said, with uncharacteristic softness, you knew something was wrong. You waited. Too long, Agnes nodded. I did. I suspect you intended to act, but inaction enabled this. I know. Her agreement earned her something few ever received from Wolfe, a small nod of respect. Finally, he turned to Calder Ames. Mr. Ames, he said, you saw Miss Carston with the bag. You saw her worry. You had the opportunity to ask, to intervene. You chose detachment. I didn't think— No, you didn't, Wolfe said. Not until it was too late. The silence after that could have cracked a watch crystal. Wolfe reached into a drawer and withdrew a photograph, Saul's find. The image of Ivy in the storage facility, clipboard in hand, standing next to the scroll. He placed it gently beside the tea bag. This, he said, is not proof alone. But it is enough. And what follows will be proof. He looked to me. Archie? I stood and opened a second folder. It contained Saul's final flourish, printed email transcripts and scanned shipping logs. Wolfe had waited to unveil them. These, I said, laying them out, show that the genuine scroll was moved twice, once to Ivy's private storage, then again to a collector in Zurich under a false lot number. The shipping forms list Merrick Consulting as the broker. Ivy's name appears once as an artistic liaison. I paused to enjoy the mix of expressions. Ivy stiff, Zane sweating, Lena unreadable, Calder guilty, Agnes still. We also found digital deletions in the gallery's shared network, all from Ivy's IP address. Wolfe took a breath. The scroll is gone, but the evidence of its passage is not, nor is the intent behind it. The tea bag was Sophie's signal. She feared someone had seen her knowledge. That fear was justified. He leaned back again. You five were not summoned for justice. That is not mine to give. You were summoned for clarity. Each of you took part in a deception, actively or passively. That deception ends here. I looked around the room. No one moved. Wolfe lifted his hand toward the phone. I will now inform Inspector Kramer of the findings. If you wish to leave, before he arrives you may. I suspect he'll know where to find you. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Zane stood first and walked out with his head down. Ivy followed him, her steps sharp and deliberate. Lena stayed long enough to say nothing with a look. Calder muttered an apology to no one in particular and vanished. Agnes remained seated. When the room was quiet again, Wolfe looked at the tea bag one last time and said, "So much fuss over a vessel of leaves." Then he rang for Fritz. The office was quiet after the suspects left, quieter than usual. Fritz had brought Wolfe a glass of beer and me a mug of hot coffee, and then wisely retreated to the kitchen. Wolfe sat in silence, his eyes on the small, ceramic dish in front of him, as if the tea bag might unfurl its final truth with one last steep. I gave him a few minutes. Then I said, "You didn't call Kramer." "I will. You told them you would immediately." "I allowed them to believe it," Wolfe said. "It served the purpose." "Which was?" He looked at me, and I knew the answer already. Pressure. Wolfe didn't need handcuffs or sirens. He dealt in guilt, not prosecution. Exposure was his gavel. He'd peeled the deception open and laid it on the table in front of them, stripped of ceremony. Now they would turn on one another, whisper, leak, lawyer up, and in the end, someone would talk, probably Ivy. She was too refined to rot in a cell. Still I had questions, and Wolfe, to his credit, answered them, slowly, as if assembling the answers like stones in a wall. "Why the tea bag?" I asked. "Why would Sophie use that?" "She didn't," Wolfe said. "Not as a message initially. It was planted. By Ivy, most likely, but Sophie understood the symbolism. She picked up the thread. That's when it became her message." "But a tea bag," Wolfe gestured slightly. "Sophie and Lena had an old conversation about subversive signals. Victorian. Salons, the use of scented sachets, politically laced teas. Ivy knew this. She weaponized it. She used it to create a false sense of communication, a breadcrumb for Sophie to follow. But Sophie didn't flee because she received the message. She fled because she saw someone else see her receive it." Calder. Wolfe nodded. "He's the wild card. I don't believe he understood the specifics, but he knew it mattered. His inaction, his reluctance to confront or confess, confirmed Sophie's worst fear, that someone had noticed her noticing. And Lena. Lena's hands are cleaner than she admits. She valued the gallery more than the truth. She suspected a fraud, perhaps even suspected Ivy, but chose ambiguity. That's not innocence, but it isn't guilt. She lied to protect the gallery. Yes. She told a version of the truth that would preserve the brand and avoid scandal. In her world, reputation is currency. Zane and Ivy, though, they were the architects. Precisely, Zane handled the laundering, Ivy made the forgery credible. Together, they sold a counterfeit with the imprimatur of legitimacy. That's a dangerous partnership. And Agnes? She suspected. But she's old and deliberate. She thought time and silence might yield confession. She underestimated speed. Wolfe shifted in his chair and stared at the tea bag again. "And now the burden will shift. To the police? To conscience," he said, "though I expect Kramer will enjoy an anonymous tip with accompanying files by tomorrow morning." That was Wolfe's version of a formal handoff. He rarely lingered in the post-mortem. Once the truth was out, the case became history. But there was still one last thread, and I decided to tug on it. "What about Sophie?" "She will return." "You think so?" "She vanished out of instinct, not strategy. She was afraid of consequences, not justice. Now that both are in motion, she will emerge." He paused. "She may even thank you." "That would be a first." He snorted lightly and raised his glass of beer. "Do you know what distinguishes this case, Archie?" I leaned back. "Besides the fact that you just solved a forgery, a sabotage, And an attempted intimidation with a cup of tea? Yes. He looked thoughtful, almost philosophical. It was not about theft, he said. It was about belief. Sophie believed in the integrity of the archive. Ivy believed in her right to manipulate it. Zane believed he could orchestrate both. Lena believed she could ride the line between knowing and denying. And you, I believe, Wolfe said, in logic and in consequences. I nodded and finished my coffee. You're lucky I found that tea bag, you know. You're lucky I knew it mattered, he replied, which, I suppose, was his version of thanks. The next morning I slid an envelope under Kramer's office door. Inside were the photographs, the appraisal logs, the scan of the scroll with the word substituted, and a handwritten note. This concludes our contribution. You'll find the rest by leaning gently. Signed, Nero Wolfe. Kramer didn't call, which meant he was furious or satisfied. Sometimes they're the same thing. That evening a letter arrived by courier, unmarked, unsigned, but the handwriting was Sophie's. Inside was a single sentence. Thank you for listening when it was hardest to speak. Below it, a pressed saffron thread. I showed it to Wolfe. He said nothing, just nodded once and folded the letter carefully. Dinner that night was pheasant, braised with saffron and a whisper of clove. Wolfe ate slowly, precisely. Then, as Fritz cleared the plates, he said without looking up, "Fraud is common, but conviction, true conviction, is rare. That is what they tried to counterfeit. I didn't have a response for that. Not right away. So I said what I always do when Wolfe lands one between the eyes. Well, that'll steep for a while." He glanced at me, half a smirk forming. Then he reached for his beer and the brownstone went quiet again. It was a Tuesday again when the last of it wrapped up. I mentioned that because it started on a Tuesday, and Wolfe liked symmetry, not in decor. He couldn't care less if a chair's leg was chipped as long as it supported his weight, but in outcomes. Neatness in people, justice, conclusions, that sort of thing. The official fallout came, as predicted, in layers. Zane Merrick was arrested first. Fraud, embezzlement, obstruction, the whole bouquet. Ivy Quillen followed less gracefully, dragged from her loft in Soho, wearing her signature, lipstick and no expression at all. Kramer called me afterward, didn't say thanks, didn't say we were right, just asked if Wolfe had any other tea flavors on the case. "I hear Earl Grey makes a good confession," I told him. He hung up. Sophie. Carsten reappeared a few days later, quietly, with a lawyer and a handwritten statement. She turned over the backup copies of her evidence, the file she'd stashed in a second location just in case, and more importantly, a full confession from Ivy. Apparently, Ivy had cracked before the cuffs even closed. She'd written the whole story down in an email draft, intending to delete it before the feds arrived. Sophie found it. The DA smiled like it was Christmas. Lena Delamere was never charged. She resigned from the gallery for personal reflection, which is publicist code for because I had to. The board gave her a painting, a send-off, and a very quiet settlement. Agnes Trent took over interim leadership. Probably still. Knitting. Probably still dangerous. Calder Ames moved out of town. Sophie didn't speak to him again. She sent Wolfe a small gift, an antique brass tea strainer shaped like a rose. He didn't comment on it, but he polished it twice a week for a month. As for Wolfe, he returned to his orchids and to his routine, as if the whole thing had been a minor disruption. But I noticed he added a new rule to the house. No tea in the office. I asked once if it was because of the case. He said it was because the smell lingered. The brownstone settled. That's the best word for it. Not healed or restored. Just settled, like leaves drifting to the bottom of a cup. One evening, a week after the dust had stopped trying to settle on our parquet floors, I came in from a late errand and found Wolfe still in the office, not reading, not writing, just sitting, hands folded, watching the steam rise from his dinner tray. Fritz had made bouillabaisse. The scent of saffron still hung faintly in the air, like a ghost of the story we'd just finished. I flopped into the red armchair. "You didn't have to keep the tea bag," I said. He raised an eyebrow. "And discard the one unambiguous witness?" "Phew!" It was still there in the small glass dish on the corner of his desk, pressed dry, framed now beneath a square of museum glass. "You going to start collecting evidence as decor? It is a reminder," he said, "that truth is often overlooked because it is unsightly or small or poorly packaged. Also, because it smells weird." He ignored that. I stretched and looked out the window. Snow had started to fall. The city does better with snow. It looks cleaner, quieter, more honest for a few hours before the plows come and everything turns back to slush and honking. "You ever wonder why people do it?" I asked. "Do what?" "Forge things. Art, love, loyalty. Why they fake it instead of find it." Wolfe took a sip of beer before answering. "Because truth is inert. It does not persuade. It simply exists. But lies can be engineered, sculpted, sold. And there is no market so lucrative as the one that trades in beauty." "That's poetic," I said. "It's inevitable," he replied. The next day I got a letter from Sophie. This one typed, straightforward, clean. She was moving to Chicago. A museum job, curation, archives, starting fresh. She thanked Wolfe. She thanked me. She said she'd never drink jasmine tea again. I didn't blame her. I read the letter aloud to Wolfe, who nodded once and then asked Fritz for more toast. That's about as moved as he gets. And just like that, it was over. The forgery, the planted bag, the vanished girl, the climbing tension, all of it faded into the usual murmur of Wolfe's everyday. Orchids, obscure philosophy, 3 daily meals, and the occasional case that knocks on the door wearing a silk scarf and a veiled threat. But something lingered longer than usual this time. Not guilt, not glory, just a quiet understanding that justice doesn't always knock people over. Sometimes it just stands very still until everyone realizes it's been in the room the whole time. The truth doesn't need to shout, and Wolfe, of all people, doesn't need to chase. He waits, and the lies inevitably come to him. Later that night after dinner we were both in the office again. Wolfe was rereading something in Montaigne. I was polishing the frame on the now infamous tea bag like I had nothing better to do. He glanced at me and said, "Archie." "Yeah?" He pointed. A finger, soft but firm. "Never underestimate what someone will do to preserve a false version of themselves." "You mean Ivy?" "I mean anyone." He closed the book, which meant the conversation and the case were officially over. I turned off the light, left the dish on the shelf, and followed him out. The door clicked shut behind us, and the brownstone went back to stillness. No more footsteps, no more lies, just quiet, and the faint scent of saffron. By the following Wednesday, the world outside had moved on. The gallery issued a public statement, long, vague, and full of art world jargon that meant, roughly translated, "We regret everything and nothing was our fault." The press gobbled it up, tossed in a scandal headline, and returned to their usual buffet of politics and celebrity mishaps. But inside the brownstone, things had gone back to normal. Wolfe was once again treating the world like it was something he occasionally allowed to exist. Orchids were back to being his only dependence, and I was sorting through receipts from the grocer, the locksmith, and a dry cleaner in Queens that somehow billed us twice for the same stain. It should have felt like closure, and it did mostly. But the truth of a Nero Wolfe case is this: resolution isn't a bang, it's a hush. It's a long exhale. The final paragraph of a book you didn't want to end, but knew had to. So when Fritz brought in the mail that afternoon and handed Wolfe a small cream-colored envelope, the room fell quiet, the way it does when you realize the code has begun. Wolfe opened it. He read slowly once, then again faster. He passed it to me. It was another note from Sophie Carston. Her handwriting, small and precise. "Mr. Wolfe, I've resigned from the gallery world. I'm taking a research position at a university in the Midwest. Quiet, slow, and honest. Your methods frightened me, but they also freed me. I know now that silence is not safety. Thank you for hearing what I didn't know how to say." With respect, S. Carston Wolfe said nothing. He folded the note with an efficiency bordering on reverence and slid it into a file folder he rarely touched. I recognized it. Clients, private, closed. Not all cases went in there, only the ones that lingered. "You think she'll be all right?" I asked. "She will," Wolfe said, "because she chose to leave the lie rather than let it root further." That, I knew, was his idea of a benediction. I leaned back. "It's funny, isn't it? All that. Fraud, forgeries, break-ins, because of a scroll no one will remember and a tea bag no one drank." "It is not the object that matters, Archie," Wolfe said. "It is the response it provokes. The bag was a signal, yes. But more than that. It was a symbol of how far people will go to obscure truth and how far others must go to restore it." I gave him a sidelong look. "So we solved a case over a cup of tea." He gave a rare smile, thin but real. "No, Archie, we solved it because the tea wasn't drunk." I let that settle. Then said, "And all without leaving the house, as God intended." Fritz entered with the dinner tray, osso buco with saffron risotto, and the aroma filled the room-like punctuation. Wolfe took the tray. I reached for the beer, and that was that. The truth had steeped. The lies had been strained out. Justice, delicate, aromatic, and slow-boiled, had been served. I closed my notebook, leaned back, and made one last note. Never trust a quiet tea bag. It might be talking after all.